Hello everyone, and welcome to my obscure little corner of the internet. Today, I'd like to talk about Charles Darwin, arguably one of the most famous scientists in history, and inarguably one of the most influential. Now, if you've passed high school biology, you've likely heard a lot about the man. You may have been told that Darwin is responsible for the theory of evolution, arriving upon it through empirical observation and careful reasoning, in contradiction to the creationist theories supported by the Christian elite of Victorian England. As a result, Darwin's ideas were dismissed and largely ridiculed, especially for implying that humanity is descended from apes. Even worse, those that accepted Darwin's theories used them to justify the most heinous crimes ever perpetrated, including segregation, forced sterilization, and genocide. Scientists later vindicated Darwin's theories, separated from the scientific racism that they were distorted into, thus canonizing Charles as a secular saint, a modern Galileo with true scientific insight, misunderstood in his own time. This is the conventional story of Darwin and his ideas, though if you decide to look into the subject, you'll quickly discover a very different narrative surrounding Darwin. In February of 2019, the YouTube channel Discovery Science released a documentary-type video titled Human Zoos, America's Forgotten History of Scientific Racism. The video talks about the history of human exhibits in the United States during the mid to late 19th century, connecting the justification and popularity of such exhibits to the racial pseudoscience of the era. The human zoos were rightly condemned by the video, and interestingly, the majority of the blame for the practice was given to scientists that believe and advocated Darwinian evolution, including Charles Darwin himself. About halfway through the video's hour-long runtime, a weird transition happens where the history of human zoos is dropped and the rest of the time is devoted to talking about American eugenics more broadly and Darwin's influence and connections to the movement. Ultimately, Darwin is painted as a racist, a classist, and a colonialist, with theories intended to justify the subjugation and annihilation of the disabled and the non-white. If you have the time, I recommend giving the documentary a quick watch, link in the description, though it's not necessary to understand this video. Since its release, the video has attracted over 3 million views and a generally positive reception from its viewers. Now, one quick Google search reveals that the Discovery Science channel is a mouthpiece for the Discovery Institute, an intelligence design think tank in the United States, which does contextualize a lot of the claims made in human zoos. These people obviously have a lot of interest in portraying Darwin as a racist monster and his theories as inherently dangerous, since their political aims specifically revolve around getting evolution out of schools. But all this obscures the actual truth of the matter. Is Darwinian evolution the product of a racist, classist man which logically extends to justify racial superiority and capitalist hierarchy? Or is Darwinism a neutral and rational scientific law that carries no such connotations? Most importantly, how should Darwin and Darwinism be viewed today? Today, I'd like to address these questions and many more, and finish by giving you my take on where we should go with Darwin. Before we dive deep, I should point out that I am in no way an authority on the history and science necessary to answer these questions. I've done a lot of reading, and I feel that my arguments are supported by the facts, but at the end of the day, I'm just some guy on the internet. If you want to look into the subject, check out my bibliography in the description. So just to warn you, the next few minutes are going to be a bit dry, but it's important to have a good understanding of Darwin's science before we dive into the real spicy stuff. The first thing I want to clarify about Darwin is that he did not, in fact, invent evolution. Though he's the figure most associated with the ideas, Darwin only contributed theories to explain the mechanisms of evolution. Many theorists had proposed evolutionary theories before Darwin, the most prominent of which was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. Lamarck's theory revolved around the inheritance of acquired characteristics, where an organism may develop a certain trait during its lifetime, which would then be inherited by its offspring. You may have heard Lamarck's cliché example of a giraffe, where it stretches its neck to reach higher and higher tree branches, incrementally lengthening its neck, and then, when the giraffe reproduces, its offspring have longer necks than the parents at birth. Lamarck's theory was published in 1809, the same year Darwin was born, and a full 50 years before Darwin published On the Origin of Species, which outlined Darwin's theories of evolution. And just what were Darwin's theories? Well, his most famous evolutionary theory is that of natural selection. Evolution is defined as the gradual change of a species across generations, while natural selection is just one mechanism of such change. So what does natural selection mean? Well, Darwin argued that not every individual has the opportunity to reproduce due to certain natural checks, such as predation and disease, but also because population growth naturally outpaces resource production in any given environment, a concept borrowed from Thomas Malthus. He also believed that individuals within a species show some diversity in their traits, with some traits being helpful towards survival, while others may have a neutral or even detrimental effect. As a result, individuals with more helpful traits are more likely to live long enough to parent offspring than those with comparatively worse traits. The following generation would thus have a greater frequency of beneficial traits, as they were parented by individuals with, themselves, disproportionately good traits. Traits. The process then repeats with more and more generations, gradually changing the physiology and behavior of the population to maximize its fitness in whatever environment it finds itself. As I had mentioned before, Human Zoos does a lot to discredit Darwin and seems pretty convincing in attaching feelings of danger with the man and his theories. The film describes various racist scientists who were firm believers in Darwinism that held abhorrent views of non-white people and advocated eugenic policies, such as forced sterilization and even genocide. However, Human Zoos doesn't explicitly argue or present arguments that Darwinism is wrong, as that would cause the documentary and the Discovery Science channel to be laughed off the face of the internet. If you want a source that disparages Darwin and shows explicit disbelief in his theories of evolution, I present to you The Darwin Myth by Benjamin Wiker, Ph.D. Weicker is himself a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, and while he disbelieves Darwin, he does admit that some form of evolution does take place. He presents moral and philosophical arguments against Darwinism, which we'll talk about later, but he also presents scientifically sounding arguments as well. In his penultimate chapter, Weicker goes on the following rant, and I quote, "The principle of natural selection by itself ran into too many contradictions. For all its strengths, it had too many weak spots. Darwin was never able to explain satisfactorily why so many transitional species were missing from the fossil record, why so many species suddenly appeared in the Cambrian period without any fossil ancestors at all, how small variations, so gradual as to be imperceptible, could be selected as beneficial, how natural selection alone could produce organs as complex as the eye on so many different evolutionary branches, let alone one branch, how radical transformations that occur in the life cycle of one species, such as occur when a caterpillar transforms into a butterfly, could ever have been naturally selected step by step. Why, if environmental conditions have varied so greatly over time and creatures are always varying under the pressure of natural selection, there are living fossils, creatures that have not changed significantly over hundreds of millions of years, like the crocodile, alligator, cockroaches, dragonflies, and so on. How natural selection could bring about changes in traits that depended on changes in a multitude of other traits to be effective and hence provide a benefit. For example, the eye, that depends on a properly curved lens and muscular structure, as well as a vast nerve network hooked into the brain to bring about the experience of vision." End quote. I probably could have shortened that quote or summarized it succinctly, but I want to emphasize that I just read 2 sentences. This is one of those 2 sentences, and it's 207 words long. Weiker's using a sort of pylon argument here to just throw as much at the reader as possible. The absence of periods between the various objections urges the reader to plow through each one, not fully absorbing each individual argument against Darwinism, but getting the impression that there are a lot of them. Basically, Weicker is pulling a Ben Shapiro in written form. It is true that Darwin himself had a hard time accounting for these sort of refutations, but plenty of subsequent scientists have filled in the gaps, and, spoiler alert, Darwinism hasn't been destroyed with facts nor logic yet. Rather than taking each of these objections on point by point, I'm just going to address one of them, that of the radical transformations that occur in the life of one species, as I believe that this point should be enough to show that Weicker doesn't really know what he's talking about. Plus, it's actually really cool, so let's talk metamorphosis. There are 3 types of life cycles among insects. One involves no metamorphosis, performed by silverfish and bristletails, where juveniles look like small versions of adults. Another involves incomplete metamorphosis, performed by crickets, cockroaches, and others, where juveniles, called nymphs, sorta resemble adults, minus developed wings and sexual organs. And another life cycle that includes complete metamorphosis, performed by butterflies, ants, beetles, and others, where juveniles look grub-like, then undergo a pupa stage, and end up looking completely different. Now, Observing metamorphosis is a bit misleading since many larvae are actually developing adult wings and legs and mouthparts and such, just we don't see it because those structures are beneath a grub-like exterior. When you think about the transition from caterpillar to butterfly, it seems pretty drastic. But if you think about it, humans go through a pretty dramatic physical change as well, from this to this. Except we don't think of it like that, instead viewing our life cycle as going from birth to adulthood. And that's why we see these transitions as so different. To some scientists, such as Lynn Ridderford and James Truman of the University of Washington in Seattle, the embryo to adult human cycle is actually a better parallel of complete metamorphosis in insects. Ridderford and James suggest that the larval stage of complete metamorphosis is equivalent to a stage in incomplete metamorphosis within the egg, known as the pro-nymphal stage. They theorize that a handful of chance mutations among insects with incomplete metamorphosis resulted in embryonic insects hatching early, but instead of eating the yolk of the egg to develop into a nymph, the embryo instead eats leaves, other insects, or rotting animals, like the larva in complex metamorphosis of today. If you look at this diagram that shows the pro-nymphal stage of a cricket, you can see that it looks kind of grub-like with its elongated body and its short stubby legs. The jump from that to adult cricket looks about as drastic as that from a caterpillar to butterfly, if you consider, like I said before, that the nymphal stage of the butterfly occurs internally. Now, why would natural selection cause this sort of situation? Why would this be advantageous? Well, there are two big ones: resource expenditure and competition. If the embryo emerges from the egg earlier, then the mother of the embryo doesn't need to devote as much energy and resources into making a yolk for the embryo to develop further. Additionally, since larvae and adults generally have different diets, a single species would have access to two different food sources, easing the pressure of competition. It's way easier to find leaves as a caterpillar if a large portion of your species at any given moment doesn't eat leaves, but instead sucks nectar. Complete metamorphosis gives more nectar to the butterflies and more leaves to the caterpillars. Okay, so much for Weicker proving Darwin wrong. Metamorphosis can, in fact, be thoroughly explained by natural selection. If you're interested in reading about why some of these other objections are also wrong, I have a few sources linked in the description. You could say I'm misrepresenting him since he specifically claims that Darwin couldn't explain these processes using natural selection. Weicker wasn't trying to list these as limitations of natural selection, you may argue. He instead wanted to challenge the idea that Darwin was some genius who had everything figured out by showing the things that Darwin couldn't explain himself. And if this is what you're thinking, well, don't be so naive. Weicker believes that natural selection is wrong, as he makes clear elsewhere in the book through his more religious arguments. I don't know if Weicker knew how flimsy these examples are as arguments against natural selection, but his intention was to bring them up as damning evidence to sow doubt in his readership. Weicker uses whatever he can get to support his preconceived conclusion that Darwinism should be forgotten as a historical relic because it's wrong and it's dangerous. We've explored why he thinks it's wrong, so let's ask, why is Darwinism seen as dangerous and repugnant to Weicker and his creationist pals? When it comes to Charles Darwin, the man often gets lost in the science, so let's briefly talk about Darwin as a man. Charles was born on February 12, 1809, in Shrewsbury, England. His mother, Susanna, was the daughter of Josiah Wedgwood, a wealthy entrepreneur who made his fortune harnessing the innovations of the Industrial Revolution to manufacture pottery. Charles's father, Robert, was a physician who was also fairly wealthy himself. Just as a fun fact, Robert's father Erasmus Darwin was also a famous evolutionary thinker, though he more staunchly advocated Lamarckian evolution of inheriting acquired characteristics than his grandson. Thus, Charles had a highly privileged upbringing, and he stayed incredibly wealthy throughout his life. Politically, Charles Darwin was strongly aligned with the Whig Party in England, which could be broadly described as classically liberal. Darwin was in favor of laissez-faire capitalism, unrestrained by government intervention, as he saw such economic conditions as vital in progressing society. In terms of social issues, Darwin was in favor of moderate reforms. He was an abolitionist, and his fellow Whigs were in favor of extending suffrage, though much of the working class would be excluded. However, he was deeply distrustful of the English left at the time, who were supportive of radical policies such as universal male suffrage and higher taxes on land and income. Though we would consider Darwin to easily be a right-winger today, it's important to keep in mind that classical liberalism was somewhat progressive in the 19th century. Unrestrained economic competition is rightly seen today as favoring those born with the most resources and connections. But it's at least slightly more fair and meritocratic than many English traditions left over from feudalism, such as male primogeniture, which Darwin opposed precisely for its issues with competition. Additionally, the Whig support of abolitionism and moderate religious toleration challenged the deeply conservative Anglican establishment. But we shouldn't give the Whigs too much credit, as they had absolutely no interest in challenging the pre-existing economic and social hierarchies in favor of real progress. Darwin's laissez-faire politics formed an integral part of his theory of evolution, as he borrowed the ideas of similarly laissez-faire thinkers to formulate natural selection, and he used natural selection in turn to justify the bitter competition associated with unrestrained capitalism. I mentioned Thomas Malthus earlier, so let's talk about him. Malthus wrote his Essay on the Principle of Population in 1798, and it basically argued, using various calculations, that modern society was on a path to catastrophe from overpopulation. Natural checks on populations, such as disease and predation, pose less and less of a threat with each passing generation, resulting in a rapidly ballooning populace. In the past, population growth had been no problem, as humanity was simply able to increase food production to meet the needs of the extra surviving people. However, in the long term, the rate of population growth rapidly increases while the rate of food production remains stagnant, eventually resulting in widespread famine and war over scant resources. Education, celibacy, and emigration may help ease some of the immediate strain, but sooner or later, the population will surpass its resources. If you've been taught about Malthus in high school, you've probably been told something like this: so scientific sounding and rational, basically uncontroversial truisms that seek to explain society objectively. However, this is not the case. Malthusianism had a strong political dimension. From these premises, Malthus concluded that the best way forward was to cut off the working class from any and all welfare and subject them to unrestrained competition in the free market. Since society can only support so many people, let's allocate resources to the most deserving first, those that outcompete the rest and rise to the top. Government handouts only serve to reward the inferior, and high taxes only serve to punish the superior. In the Malthusian world, those that prove superior to the rest in the free market must be elevated to ensure that they have the resources to survive Malthusian catastrophe. In other words, inequality is not an unfortunate side effect, but a moral imperative. In an equal society, everyone feels the pinch from the famine, resulting in the strong suffering as much as the weak. This, Malthus finds tragic. I should note that even though they may sound cogent, Malthus's ideas have been generally discredited. It's been more than 200 years since Malthus wrote his essay, and we still haven't experienced this prophesized collapse from insufficient resources. This is largely because Malthus didn't foresee all the innovations in agriculture that we've developed since 1798, and now we easily have the capability of providing enough food to support 10 billion people. Nor did he predict the drop in birth rates in the developed world. However, at the time, Malthus was incredibly influential, and his work formed an important element of Whig economic policy during the 19th century. In 1832, a royal commission on the operation of the English Poor Laws recommended that the laws be updated to cut off government relief and assistance to all but the most destitute English citizens, with one of the economists on the commission, Nassau William Sr., specifically citing Malthus as his justification for such action. In 1834, the Whig government passed an amendment to the Poor Laws doing just that. Since the laissez-faire society that Malthus advocated fit in so well with the interests of the wealthy, the aristocratic Whigs quickly grasped onto it, Charles Darwin included. Though the idea of a struggle for survival had been bouncing around Darwin's head well before 1838 when he read Malthus's essay, such struggle became an integral part of Darwin's theory once he was exposed to it. Darwin concluded that animals over-reproduce like humans, resulting in competition over scarce resources, and like the Malthusian ideal, the weak must perish in order for the strong to prosper. Death held an important place in nature, as it ensured that the weak and inferior didn't waste too many resources that could be used on the strong. Thus, bitter competition is vital in biological systems in order for species to better themselves through evolution. Perhaps the most important contribution that Malthus's essay provided to Darwinian evolution is that competition doesn't just occur between separate species, but rather members of the same species. When scientists had applied competition for resources in nature, they typically talked about chimpanzees competing with gorillas or oaks competing with maples and so on, treating species as a unified front that aimed for the success of each of its members. But with his understanding understanding of Malthus, Darwin extended the competition to members of the same species, a free-for-all where an individual competes for itself and no one else. From his reading of Malthus, Darwin made his theory very individualistic and very reliant on competition, just like laissez-faire capitalism, a comparison which didn't escape Darwin at the time, as we'll see later on. Now, when it comes to discussing the application of Darwin's biological ideas on human society, Herbert Spencer is an important figure to bring up. Spencer was a contemporary of Darwin and wrote many of his most important philosophical works before Darwin had published On the Origin of Species. However, Spencer was a staunch evolutionist, and many scholars, such as historian Richard Weicker, agree that Spencer came very close to independently discovering natural selection, based on his 1852 essay, A Theory of Population, deduced from the general law of animal fertility. In that essay, Spencer applies Malthusianism to evolution, just like Darwin, though Spencer focused specifically on human evolution. Since Darwin hadn't published his On the Origin of Species until 1859, and he kept his ideas secret, fearing the wrath of the conservative scientific establishment, Darwin's ideas heavily borrowed from Lamarckian evolution, which become apparent when examining Spencer's ideas of human evolution. Spencer agreed with Malthus that the pressure exerted on a population from limited resources should foster competition between the working class to elevate the strongest from the weak in conditions of laissez-faire capitalism. He agreed that government intervention only serves to punish those who succeed and rewards those who fail to compete. In a perfectly free market system, the resources would naturally allocate to the strongest and most competent, while those at the bottom likely wouldn't survive. All this is sounding very Malthusian, but crucially, Spencer goes on to say that this process fosters progress, as those that cannot compete in the free market are less able to start a family, resulting in subsequent generations populated by the offspring of the strong. If you think that I must be describing Spencer's ideas unfairly, as if it's impossible for someone to be this ghoulish, let me read an excerpt from an 1851 essay. And I quote, "The poverty of the incapable, the distresses that come upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and those shoulderings aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and in miseries, are the decrees of a large far-seeing benevolence. Nevertheless, when regarded not separately but in connection with the interests of universal humanity, these harsh fatalities are seen to be full of the highest beneficence, the same beneficence which brings to early graves the children of diseased parents, and singles out the low-spirited, the intemperate, and the debilitated as the victims of an epidemic." End quote. Not a very cheery guy, that Spencer. Anyway, with the passing of more and more generations, with the weakest of each generation dying before reproducing, this increasingly betters humanity. Fertility will decline to the point that it equals or exceeds resource production, resulting in a utopia where everyone in society can be provided for. Additionally, humans would also advance morally and culturally to the point that government wouldn't be necessary. So with this sort of future in mind, Spencer had a sort of ends justify the means argument. It might suck now, with all the poor people dying from neglect and such, but eventually things will be great. Spencer describes the acquisition of better human traits in very Lamarckian terms, as he claimed that the free market conditions incentivize people to develop increased intellectual and physical capabilities within their lifetimes, which they then pass on their acquired abilities to their offspring. Nonetheless, when Darwin finally published his ideas in 1859, Spencer quickly embraced Darwinism and concluded that Lamarckism was insufficient as a biological theory. His views on society remained relatively unchanged by substituting Darwinian ideas of evolution, mostly since, as I mentioned before, Darwin himself incorporated ideas from Lamarck. But once it became clear that Darwin's attempts to preserve Lamarckism through pangenesis failed, Spencer's ideas became viewed in an even darker light, as those that rose to the top of the laissez-faire hierarchy didn't do so through self-improvement available to everyone, but instead innate, unchanging traits that determined one's fitness from birth. We'll have a good talk about eugenics in a bit, but for now, let's have a chat about a related topic, that of social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is an idea frequently attributed to Herbert Spencer, as his ideas were among the first that applied Darwin's ideas to humanity. But since he had published his social Darwinist ideas well before On the Origin of Species, it seems at first almost unfair to attribute Spencer's ghoulish ideas to Darwin. In fact, social Darwinism is often considered by many to be a misapplication of Darwinism proper, a shallow pseudoscientific pretext to justify racism and classism that Darwin himself surely would have objected to. Apologists for Darwin like to cling to semantics, saying that the phrase survival of the fittest wasn't actually used in Darwin's original writings on the subject. Or, as historian Robert Bannister points out in reference to the full title of Darwin's book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life, And I quote, "Since Darwin meant pigeons, not people, in referring to struggle, all applications to human society were nonsense." End quote. However, other than unconvincing by themselves, these semantics arguments ultimately hold no water. While it's true that Darwin never used the phrase survival of the fittest in On the Origin of Species, and that, in fact, it was Herbert Spencer who coined the phrase, Darwin did use the phrase in later works and even later editions of On the Origin. Additionally, as Richard Weicker points out in his essay on social Darwinism, Darwin applied natural selection to humanity a great deal, as he even wrote a whole book tackling the subject, The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. As you can probably tell, long titles were certainly in fashion at the time. Of the many works Darwin published, The Descent of Man is by far the most controversial, as he comments on politics and economics through the lens of his theory of natural selection, as well as broaching the topic of race, which we'll save for later. In his concluding remarks, Darwin makes a fairly transparent argument in favor of laissez-faire capitalism along biological lines. And I quote, "If humanity is to advance higher, he must remain subject to a severe struggle. Otherwise, he would soon sink into indolence, and the more highly gifted men would not be more successful in the battle of life than the less gifted. Hence, our natural rate of increase, though leading to many and obvious evils, must not be greatly diminished by any means. There should be open competition for all men, and the most able should not be prevented by laws or customs from succeeding best in rearing the largest number of offspring." End quote. Just to be clear, even though Darwin doesn't specifically refer to capitalism or whatever, he is in fact talking about competition in the free market in this section. This is pretty apparent when he refers to the most and not able being prevented by laws or customs, as the idea of competition stifled by law is one distinctly associated with the free market. Just like Herbert Spencer, Darwin saw laissez-faire capitalism as necessary to progress humanity. He advocates for competition unhindered by governmental restrictions, claiming that without that competition, the highly gifted would not have a reproductive advantage over the less gifted, resulting in, quote, "many and obvious evils." End quote. It should be fairly obvious that Spencer and Darwin had basically the same prescriptions for society to progress, even though Spencer was a bit more Lamarckian about it. But this shouldn't come as a surprise. Both men based their social outlooks on Thomas Malthus, incorporating the importance of unfettered competition and of economic inequality to argue that laissez-faire capitalism is not only the path to avoid catastrophe, but to improve humanity. It should, thus, be uncontroversial to say that Darwin was a social Darwinist. He broadly favored free market conditions to foster competition so that the best rise to the top and seed the world with bright offspring, while the weak hopefully get outbred as a result of their destitution. His ideas were very similar to those of Herbert Spencer, the man most associated with social Darwinism, and the two largely considered themselves as allies. They cited each other in their works frequently, and though they were never close friends themselves, Spencer and Darwin had many mutual friends, such as Thomas Huxley and Robert Hooker. Thus, the common perception that social Darwinism was a corruption of Darwin's ideas is nonsense. Darwin was as socially Darwinian as it gets. The conversation gets a bit more complicated when we talk about eugenics, however. Before we delve into that, I should be clear with what I define as eugenics in comparison to just social Darwinism. As I've alluded to before, I'm using social Darwinism to mean the belief that Darwinism should be applied to society through enacting policies that foster competition, such as laissez-faire economics, to better humanity. I'm using eugenics, however, to refer to practices and policies aimed to actively promote the fertility of certain people over others, often to escape or speed up natural selection. Thus, the distinction I'm working with is that social Darwinism is letting nature take its course, while eugenics is taking matters into our own hands. The difference between natural selection and artificial selection. Sometimes eugenics is considered as a subset of social Darwinism, since it relies on many of the same assumptions, which can be useful in some instances, but for the purposes of this video, I'm treating the ideas as different. So, was Charles Darwin himself a eugenicist? Those who answer the question in the affirmative often cite a specific passage in The Descent of Man, which does sound pretty damning. It's even read in human zoos.
We civilized men do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone, to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands, who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed.
Pretty damning stuff, right? Well, perhaps not as much as it seems. Here's the passage that the quote comes from, and here highlighted are the words that were read in the documentary. You can see that there is a little bit that was skipped towards the end. So, in full, that last sentence reads, and I quote, "It is surprising how soon want of care, or care wrongly directed, leads to the degeneration of a domestic race. But, excepting in the case of man himself, hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to breed." End quote. Okay, so Darwin appears to be making an exception for humanity here when he describes the breeding of the, quote, worst animals as ignorant. It seems that there is more to this story. Indeed, many apologists for Darwin cite the next few sentences, which come after this infamous quote, as clarifying his position. So let's take a look. And I quote, "The aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy, which was originally acquired as part of the social instincts, but subsequently rendered, in the manner previously indicated, more tender and more widely diffused. Nor could we check our sympathy, if so urged by hard reason, without deterioration in the noblest part of our nature. The surgeon may harden himself whilst performing an operation, for he knows that he is acting for the good of his patient. But if we were intentionally to neglect the weak and helpless, it could only be for contingent benefit, with a certain and great present evil. Hence, we must bear without complaining the undoubtedly bad effects of the weak surviving and propagating their kind. But there appears to be at least one check and steady action, namely the weaker and inferior members of society not marrying so freely as the sound. And this check might be indefinitely increased, though this is more to be hoped for than expected, by the weak in body or mind refraining from marriage." End quote. He makes it clear here that he doesn't want the, quote, weak and helpless being prevented from breeding, at least not actively. Darwin instead hopes that pre-existing societal structures, such as marriage not being as available to lower classes, will be enough to maintain biological progress in modern society. Elsewhere, in The Descent of Man, Darwin further clarifies that there is no need for drastic, illiberal action to improve humanity's genetic stock. And I quote, "If in each grade of society the members were divided into two equal bodies, the one including the intellectually superior and the other the inferior, there can be little doubt that the former would succeed best in all occupations and rear a greater number of children. Even in the lowest walks of life, skill and ability must be of some advantage, though in many occupations, owing to the great division of labor, a very small one. Hence, in civilized nations, there will be some tendency to an increase both in the number and the standard of the intellectually able." End quote. Thus, Darwin didn't support measures that would restrict the reproductive freedom of the supposedly inferior members of society because he expected the supposedly superior to naturally outbreed them. In Darwin's mind, securing the biological improvement of humanity is as simple as letting nature take its course, which, as we've already discussed, means conditions of laissez-faire capitalism. Besides viewing active eugenic policy as unnecessary, Darwin also objected to it politically. Francis Galton, Darwin's cousin and originator of the term eugenics, proposed a family registry system among the upper classes which would pair different people for marriage and encourage them to reproduce. Darwin saw the proposal as impractical, but also dangerously restrictive and illiberal. Instead, Darwin preferred that the public be educated on issues related to inheritance and let them make their own decisions, confident that they would opt for what was best for society. From this, it should be pretty clear that Darwin would absolutely disprove of the most infamous eugenic measures of the 20th century, such as forced sterilization in the United States and extermination in Europe. However, there are still a lot of problems with how Darwin talks about issues pertinent to eugenics and the descent of man. As we've seen before, Darwin does clearly describe people as objectively superior and inferior, and admits that letting the supposedly inferior members of society continue to rear children has undoubtedly bad effects. Darwin held that inheritance was an important, if not the sole, determinant of fitness and superiority, and he was ultimately convinced by Galton that intelligence not only varies considerably between people, but that such variance is heritable. Darwin believed much of the pseudoscientific nonsense that later eugenicists found to be reasonable grounds to commit some of the most atrocious acts in human history. Now, an apologist might say that Darwin simply believed the mainstream science of the time, which is true, and he makes it clear that he would have seriously objected to the crimes against humanity later committed in the name of eugenics, so he should therefore be absolved of any guilt for his contributions to such crimes. As important of a figure that Darwin has become, it's tempting to brush this stuff aside. But Benjamin Weicker, and I can't believe I'm saying this, makes a strong point to the contrary. Weicker takes issue with the ideas in The Descent of Man about morality, which Darwin claims is derived through natural selection. And I quote, "When two tribes of primeval man living in the same country come into competition, if the one tribe included, other circumstances being equal, a greater number of courageous, sympathetic, and faithful members, who are always ready to warn each other of danger, to aid and defend each other, this tribe would without doubt succeed best and conquer the other. Thus, the social and moral qualities would tend slowly to advance and be diffused throughout the world." End quote. Darwin saw that sympathy and morality cohesively bound a group together, which would increase the survival of that group compared to more fractured and disunified groups. As a result, humanity becomes more sympathetic as evolution progresses. And I quote, "As man gradually advanced in intellectual power and was enabled to trace the more remote consequences of his actions, as he acquired sufficient knowledge to reject baneful customs and superstitions, as he regarded more and more not only the welfare but the happiness of his fellow man, as from habit, following on beneficial experience, instruction, and example, his sympathies become more tender and widely diffused, so as to extend to the men of all races, to the imbecile, the maimed, and other useless members of society, and finally to the lower animals. So would the standard of his morality rise higher and higher." End quote. Weicker points out that a higher sense of morality doesn't exist in Darwin's framework, since certain moral qualities are only beneficial in certain circumstances. While sympathy may be selected in some instances, aggression and self-interestedness would also be selected under other circumstances. Since Darwin also introduces competition between tribes as the driving factor for moral development, he's essentially making a might makes right argument, where any morals that serve to outcompete the others must therefore be seen as true and good. Darwin seems to argue here that sympathy trumps all other moral frameworks and will always win regardless of circumstances, but Darwin contradicts himself later on in the section we looked at earlier. He said that, as a result of our naturally derived sympathy, we must therefore bear the detrimental effects of the quote-unquote inferior people's breeding, as a deprivation of such would be morally abhorrent. But if one believes that morals are defined by that which results in the biological improvement of humanity, and eugenic policies would help direct that biological improvement, it follows that eugenic measures must therefore be morally correct. Even if Darwin objected to the forced sterilization, segregation, and genocide committed in the name of eugenics, The Descent of Man provides a solid basis from which to justify these atrocious acts. Darwin claims that superiority can be inherited. Darwin claims that morality is defined by success in biological competition. Darwin admits our sympathy for the supposedly inferior members of society has had a negative biological impact. From this, it isn't a huge leap to deduce that active eugenic policy must be enacted and the breeding of the inferior must be stopped by any means necessary. Though Darwin himself must have rolled over in his grave in response to the horrid actions committed to forward natural selection, his ideas and writings were very convenient for the eugenicists that enacted those heinous policies. Before I move on to the final section and talk about Darwin's views on race, I just want to note that Darwinism had political impacts outside of encouraging laissez-faire capitalism or authoritarian right policies of controlling reproduction. Specifically, some of Darwin's ideas were embraced by socialists and progressives, as they found justification for left-wing ideas in Darwin's theory. One of the big parts of Darwinism that appealed to the left was that it was completely materialistic, or completely dependent on the material world without the inclusion of any supernatural forces. As you can imagine, the materialism of Darwin's ideas was the biggest complaint that religious conservatives had, seeing it as borderline heretical to exclude God from the affairs of life. To the progressives and socialists, many of whom were atheists, a materialist theory of life provided a new front to attack the religious Tory establishment in order to struggle for progressive change. One part of Darwin's theory, which was particularly popular among the English left, was that of pangenesis. Pangenesis was the idea that cells all over the body threw off particles known as gemmules into the bloodstream, which aggregated into sperm and eggs for sexual reproduction. Pangenesis was seen as particularly useful to the left, as it relied on each individual cell providing the necessary components for reproduction. Essentially, the creation of new life is a bottom-up affair, which attracted those who sought a bottom-up approach to politics. If each of the cells together contribute to reproduction, perhaps each human together should democratically contribute to government. Regardless, what I'm trying to convey here is that Darwinian natural selection had a political impact beyond justifying laissez-faire capitalism, even when that's the only interpretation Darwin wants you to walk away with. Unfortunately, it's the regressive interpretations of Darwinism that make the history books. And in that spirit, let's look at Darwinism's relationship with race. Lincoln and Darwin, Shared Visions of Race, Science, and Religion is a biography about both Abraham Lincoln and Charles Darwin, as both men were born on the same date, February 12, 1809, and as the title suggests, there are many parallels in the lives and ideas of the two men. As you can guess, by pairing him with one of the most famous historical figures related to abolition, James Lander, the book's author, aims for a glorified depiction of Darwin, often downplaying Darwin's more unsavory ideas and spending a lot of the book focused upon Darwin's opposition to slavery and the supposedly racially progressive elements of Darwinism. To illustrate what I'm talking about when it comes to these glorified depictions, the third chapter of the book, titled The Racial Background, Personal Encounters, and Turning Points in 1837, tries to convey that while both Lincoln and Darwin held some ideas that we would now consider to be racist, they were remarkably progressive on racial issues beginning from an early age. In the words of the book, it is not surprising that both men were affected by this view, referring to white supremacy, but it is surprising how much they rejected it. The chapter goes on to describe laughably unconvincing anecdotes that demonstrate this supposed rejection of white supremacy between Lincoln and Darwin, which really shows how low of a bar there is for important historical figures for us to consider them the slightest bit progressive. Though not terribly relevant to our discussion today, I want to briefly describe Lincoln's supposedly anti-racist anecdote because it's just hilarious. Okay, so in the 1830s, the state of Illinois was waging a genocidal war against the local indigenous peoples in an effort to drive them out of the state, and Lincoln joined a local militia as an officer to help the state in that cause. One night, an elderly indigenous man walked into the camp set up by Lincoln and his small militia group. The militiamen were ready to murder the old man instantly as they were fighting a genocidal war to rid indigenous peoples from Illinois, but Lincoln had made the bold decision of saying, "Hey, maybe we shouldn't instantly murder an old man on sight." And in that moment, God himself descended from the heavens and said, "Abraham, my child, you are so woke, such an anti-racist icon. How brave a decision to spare the life of an old indigenous man who posed no threat, rather than murder him without a second thought. Clearly, you are the least racist man who has ever lived." Okay, so the chapter even admits that Lincoln evidently had no qualms about fighting Indians or about the removal policy, given that he voluntarily signed up to do some genocide. I honestly can't believe that this is somehow posed as Lincoln being exceptionally woke for the time, as if our bar for racism among historical figures is so low that anything less than instantly murdering non-white people on sight is considered racially progressive. So, what about Darwin? How does this chapter argue that Darwin rejected white supremacy? Well, the book's anecdotes here are far less dramatic, but I would argue are far more insidious in their whitewashing. As you might know, between the years of 1831 and 1836, Charles Darwin sailed aboard the HMS Beagle on a trip circumnavigating the world. The Beagle was surveying the coast of South America, and Darwin was only there as a dining partner for the ship's captain. But Darwin spent most of his time on land hiking through landscapes and finding fossils. The Beagle was also in charge of repatriating 3 Fuegians, who were indigenous to Tierra del Fuego, who had previously lived in England, quite separated from their indigenous culture, and the 3 even converted to Christianity. Darwin, as well as the rest of the crew of the Beagle, had a lot of contact with many different indigenous peoples throughout the course of the half-decade they were at sea. And it is this interaction with indigenous peoples that Lander considers to show Darwin's rejection of white supremacy. Specifically, Lander talks about Darwin's first contact with Fuegians at Tierra del Fuego and the differences he perceives between them and the Fuegians on board the Beagle. And I quote, "Darwin, having lived with these civilized natives for several months, was shocked when he first saw Fuegians in their original habitat." And this is quoting from Darwin's diaries. "These poor wretches were stunted in their growth, their hideous faces daubed with white paint, their skins filthy and greasy, their hair entangled, their voices discordant, and their gestures violent. Viewing such men, one can hardly make oneself believe that they are fellow creatures and inhabitants of the same world." And Lander continues, "And yet, Darwin believed in their essential humanity and attributed the differences between the civilized and the savage to social development rather than any specific racial differences." End quote. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Lander says that Darwin believed in their essential humanity, though the quote he cites shows that Darwin believes this only begrudgingly, and he still calls them filthy, hideous wretches. Later on, in Voyage of the Beagle, Darwin remarks that, and I quote, "I believe in this extreme part of South America, man exists in a lower state of improvement than in any other part of the world." Unquote. It's pretty apparent in Darwin's own words that he viewed the Fuegians as distinctly inferior to Europeans, and thus his acknowledgement of their essential humanity should be treated as absolutely meaningless. Again, it shows the incredibly low bar Lander has set up for Darwin. As long as he doesn't use the term subhuman, he's suddenly a woke king. And to the point about Darwin attributing the differences between the civilized and the savage to social development, he emphatically did not. After the Beagle dropped off the 3 Christian Fuegians to their tribes for the purpose of evangelizing the faith, the Beagle crew spent some time in the Falkland Islands and later returned to find that one of the Fuegians, whom the English named Jemmy Button, had already reacculturated back into the Fuegian tribe, and his supposedly civilized ways were but a distant memory. Adrian Desmond, in his biography Darwin, described the effect that this encounter had on Darwin, and I quote, "Jemmy's habits were ingrained, it was now obvious. For untold generations his people had adapted to this wilderness, and no civilizing influence could erase his deep-seated instincts." End quote. While Darwin may have initially believed that social development accounted for differences between the civilized and savage, he later thought from seeing Jemmy reverted to his indigenous roots that geographic and environmental conditions instead determined savagery. The idea of environmental determinism has a long history of being used by colonialists to prove European supremacy and therefore justify subjugation and exploitation. The theory goes that Europeans, specifically Northern Europeans, are superior since Europe is a colder climate than Africa, Asia, the Americas, and most other places Europeans colonized. The cold climate hardened the European peoples, allowing them to outcompete the other races. You can see how natural selection, and more specifically social Darwinism, neatly fits in here. The irony here, of course, is that Tierra del Fuego is itself a very hostile and cold climate, which Darwin himself points out in his journal. However, when detailing the effect of cold climate on racial development, much later in The Descent of Man, Darwin is sure to tweak the idea to account for exceptions. And I quote, "Progress seems to depend on many concurrent favorable conditions, far too complex to be followed out. But it has often been remarked that a cool climate, from leading to industry and the various arts, has been highly favorable, or even indispensable for this end. The Eskimo, pressed by hard necessity, have succeeded in many ingenious inventions, but their climate has been too severe for continued progress." End quote. So, racially derogatory language aside, Darwin described a cool climate as indispensable, but claims that the climate can't be too severe and cites the Inuit peoples of North America as an example of supposedly inferior peoples occupying a cold climate. Ah, I see. So the climate has to be cold to yield the master race, but not too cold. What a coincidence that the British fall right into that sweet spot, huh, Charles? So I could go on and talk about Charles's interactions with every non-white group encountered on the Beagle adventure, but it's pretty easy to summarize Darwin's thoughts. He considered non-white groups savage unless they had adopted Christianity, in which case they were civilized but still inferior. That's basically it. All right, speaking more broadly about Lincoln and Darwin, slavery is perhaps the largest running theme in both Lincoln and Darwin's biographies. It makes sense for Lincoln since he's primarily known for being in office when slavery was abolished, but less so for Darwin. As I've mentioned before, Darwin was a staunch abolitionist, and he did care a lot about the cause, but Lander's book is so preoccupied with that fact that it paints everything Darwin does or thinks as forwarding the cause of abolition. I think this is where the bias comes from to paint Darwin and Darwinism as advocating racial justice and equality, which, to put it mildly, is pure fantasy. However, Lander's book is still useful, because if Darwinism forwarded racial justice in any way, it would be found in this book. What, if anything, does Lander provide for us to view Darwin as racially progressive? Well, Lander makes a big deal about Darwin being a monogenist, or an advocate for placing each human race within the same species. This addresses a scientific controversy of the day, where the dissenters to the monogenists were the polygenists, who advocated placing each human race as separate species. Naturally, the polygenists tended to be more explicitly white supremacist, colonialist, and pro-slavery, because if non-whites were another species, that would provide a justification to treat them like any other creature that weren't a part of the human species. or white species in this hypothetical. Louis Agassiz was one particular polygenist of the time, and in Lincoln and Darwin, he's almost characterized as an antagonist to Darwin, if such a term even applies to a historical biography. Agassiz's polygenism was tightly wrapped up in creationism, as he basically argued that each race was created separately in different creation events, and thus, each race has distinct lineages. Darwin, on the other hand, believed that each race had descended from a common ancestor, and humanity still remained closely related enough to be classified within the same species. Thus, since Darwin's was the more egalitarian theory of the two, by seeing humanity as unified into the same species, Lander can argue that Darwin was a progressive icon somehow. Perhaps you already see the problem here. The two ideas that Darwin believed on the subject, that all humanity shared a common ancestor and that all of humanity is the same species, are not mutually inclusive ideas. In fact, plenty of Darwinians, including Alfred Russel Wallace, were polygenists, but just that the human races had differentiated into separate species only recently. So the premise that Darwinian natural selection was an inherently progressive force in racial politics is completely inaccurate. It may have contradicted Agassiz's separate creation theory, but like the Hydra of Greek myth, where one theory falls, numerous grow to take its place. Outside of rather stale debates of polygenism, evolutionary thought allowed the formation of plenty of novel, racist, pseudoscientific theories as well. I already mentioned environmental determinism, so let's talk about another. Recapitulation. This theory was first enumerated in the 1820s, but later elaborated by Ernst Haeckel, an avid Darwinian and close colleague of Darwin himself, and one of the many racist boogeymen of human zoos. Haeckel basically thought that embryonic development follows, or recapitulates, evolutionary chronology. For example, the early human embryos look kind of like fish, and later they look kind of like amphibians, and later they look like reptiles, and so on. This theory is summarized by the phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Ontogeny referring to development, phylogeny referring to evolutionary chronology, and recapitulation referring to summarization, if that's a word. Is that a word? The big implication of this theory is that it develops a hierarchy of evolutionary forms based on the order of embryonic development, with animals like fish being considered less evolved and amphibians being slightly more evolved, and so on until you get to the most evolved form, humanity. Okay, so where does the racism come in? Well, Haeckel and the other recapitulationists also considered non-white people to share a lot of characteristics with white children and adolescents, including behavior, but also in physical appearance, supposedly. Obviously, all of that was basically projection, the logical extension of paternalistic racism to the point that non-white people are literally equivalent to white children. In addition to the paternalism, this served an even more explicitly racist motivation, however, as when you combine the non-white adult equals white children observation with recapitulation, you find that non-white people must therefore precede white people in the evolutionary hierarchy. Since the white form comes after the non-white form in ontogeny, white must come after non-white in phylogeny. Therefore, white people are superior since they are more evolved. Obviously, the whole non-white people are basically children stuff is nonsense, but the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny theory of embryonic development has also been heavily discredited. Developmental biology now follows the von Baer theory to describe the relationship between embryonic development and evolution, as rather than serving as a sequence of past adult forms, the embryo serves basically as a common animal template almost, where more recently evolved creatures diverge from the template later than creatures who had differentiated earlier. Notice I'm saying more recently evolved rather than more evolved, because saying something is more evolved than something else, especially if the two organisms live at the same time, is nonsense. It's true that lizards, for example, descended from fish at some point, and they look far different from their ancestral fish than modern fish. But that doesn't mean that lizards are more evolved, since natural selection acted upon the ancestors of the modern fish as well. Just as a brief side note, as I was researching this video, I ended up on a creationist site called Answers in Genesis on an article titled Recapitulation Theory, How Embryology Does Not Prove Evolution, which basically talks about why recapitulation is wrong because of this reason and another, but that's not what's important. What's funny about this is that the article describes the ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny phrase as a popular high school statement and later says it persists in the educational system. And it's like, what high school did you go to? Oh, of course, Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. What a memorable and simple slogan from my days in high school. That one's probably right up there with mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. Honestly, how dishonest do you need to be to bring up a long discredited theory as representative of modern evolutionary thought? Okay, so recapitulation is racist. It was popularized by a racist who was also a Darwinian. But is the theory itself inherently Darwinian? Is there something about the racism that can be traced as a logical extension of Darwinism? The answer is not really. The theory is certainly compatible with Darwinian evolution, but really the only similarity between Darwinism and recapitulation was the fact that both depended on species gradually changing into different species, which, is the same for basically all evolutionary theories. Darwin himself criticized the idea that embryonic forms had a significant similarity with adult forms of other animals, instead supposing that any similarities could be due to the existence of a common ancestor. The truth is, Haeckel had all the pieces of his theory without Darwinism, as evolutionary theories were plentiful before Darwin. However, it is reasonable to assume that a recapitulation theory of racial hierarchy wouldn't have been as popular if it wasn't for Darwinism. With the publishing of Darwin's theory of evolution in 1859, evolutionary thought became more popular than it had ever been before. Part of this was due to the fact that Darwin was already a prominent figure in British science, but also because On the Origin of Species was just a well-written and well-argued piece of scientific literature. Additionally, natural selection appealed to capitalists, socialists, and anyone in between, as we've seen before. Because of this popularity, racists could now use evolution as the basis for whatever pseudoscientific nonsense and would have a considerably more influence, since it would inherit some degree of legitimacy from being linked to Darwinism. This is why Stephen Jay Gould said that, and I quote, "Biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1859, but they increased by orders of magnitude after the acceptance of evolutionary theory." End quote. Gould's specific reference to 1859, which is the release date of On the Origin of Species, has resulted in many creationists citing this specific quote as proof that Darwinism leads to racist thinking. What's missing here is that racist pseudoscience increased by orders of magnitude because evolution became a more prominent scientific theory, and evolution raised ideas such as biological improvement and humanity descending from animals, which could be used by some to argue that human groups are more improved than others or are closer to animals than others. What I'm trying to convey here is that Darwinism did allow many racist pseudoscientific ideas to be developed and thrust into the mainstream. This was a side effect of evolution given scientific legitimacy by Darwin, rather than inspiration drawn from Darwin's theory specifically. As a result, racist theories like recapitulation, which derive from evolution but have little to do with Darwinism, were given some degree of credibility at the time. However, Darwin did have many racist ideas that he attempted to justify using natural selection. Most egregious is the way he talks about genocide and extermination in The Descent of Man. Darwin often describes racial extermination as inevitable and natural, with the stronger and favored tribes always coming out on top, and the weaker tribes doomed to extinction. And I quote, "Extinction follows chiefly from the competition of tribe with tribe and race with race. Various checks are always in action, which serve to keep down the numbers of each savage tribe, such as periodical famines, the wandering of parents and the consequent deaths of infants, prolonged suckling, the stealing of women, wars, accidents, sickness, licentiousness, especially infanticide, and perhaps lessened fertility from less nutritious food, and many hardships. If from any cause any one of these checks is lessened, even in a slight degree, the tribe thus favored will tend to increase, and when one of two adjoining tribes becomes more numerous and powerful than the other, the contest is soon settled by war, slaughter, cannibalism, slavery, and absorption. Even when a weaker tribe is not thus abruptly swept away, if it once begins to decrease, it generally goes on decreasing until it is extinct." You may notice the phrase, "each savage tribe," that Darwin is specifically referring to the interactions between underdeveloped, supposedly savage groups, not necessarily the interactions between supposedly civilized people and these supposed savages. An apologist might argue that Darwin would therefore consider the civilized to be above such abhorrently amoral behavior. But if you want to hear Darwin's thoughts about civilized races exterminating supposedly inferior peoples, The Descent of Man has you covered there as well. Here, Darwin is talking about evolutionary breaks, where a creature looks nothing like its closest relative, with no living intermediates that resemble a mix of the two, and I quote, "All these breaks depend merely on the number of related forms which have become extinct. At some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace throughout the world the savage races. At the same time, the anthropomorphous apes will no doubt be exterminated. The break will then be rendered wider, for it will intervene between man in a more civilized state, as we may hope, than the Caucasian, and some ape as low as a baboon, instead of, as at present, between the Nymphal or Australian and the gorilla. End quote. So notice right at the end where he portrays the difference between Africans and Aboriginal Australians with the gorilla as the gap between humanity and apes, implying that Africans and Australians are the humans closest to apes. But that's not even the worst part about this quote. Clearly here, as before, Darwin clearly considers racial extermination to be a natural process. In Lincoln and Darwin, Lander tries to downplay these quotes by pointing out that Darwin makes reference to some race more civilized than the Caucasian, which apparently means that Darwin doesn't think white people are the end of evolution and that it's possible for a new race of humanity to outcompete them. Again, this shows the incredibly low bar Lander has set for Darwin. He doesn't believe that whites are the greatest race to ever exist, so Darwin can't be all that racist. Not to mention, Darwin clearly says that the civilized races of the immediate future are the ones doing the exterminating. So unless Darwin thinks that this new master race that surpasses the Caucasians are going to arrive spontaneously any day now, he obviously thinks the extermination will be at the hands of the Europeans. Perhaps this is a bit obvious, but it cannot be left unsaid. This, too, is social Darwinism. It's clear that Darwin finds racial extermination as an extension of the competition that drives natural selection, specifically how he focuses on traits and environmental conditions in determining the supposed winner of a racial struggle. Another thing Lander argues about these sections is that Darwin may think extermination is natural, but he broaches the issue as if he's simply describing reality, not justifying and certainly not endorsing the extermination, and this is true to a certain extent. Anytime Darwin commented about genocide and racial extermination outside of his scientific works, he was conflicted about the issue. When he was in the Argentinian Patagonia, Darwin seemed to view the ongoing genocide against the indigenous peoples there as reprehensible, but for the greater good. And I quote, "This war of extermination, though carried out with the most shocking barbarity, will certainly produce great benefits. It will at once throw open 400 or 500 miles in length of fine country for the produce of cattle." End quote. So not only does he consider the extermination beneficial, Darwin also doesn't seem to have a problem with the genocide itself, but rather the manner with which it's carried out. Darwin did ultimately appear against the conflict, however, and I quote, "The country will be in the hands of white gaucho savages instead of copper-colored Indians, the former being a little superior in civilization as they are inferior in every moral virtue." End quote. It seems as if we have a similar situation to the eugenics discussion described earlier. Like eugenics, Darwin is morally against genocide in practice, though he concedes that the results of genocide can also be for the greater biological good, since it frees up resources for the supposedly superior race. However, like the eugenics issue, Darwin's ideas about the origins of morality, where any acts that benefit oneself in natural selection are by definition moral, causes problems for anyone who takes Darwin's words in The Descent of Man at face value. Maybe genocide, in fact, can be justified, some reader of Darwin's may conclude, since we know we're superior, thus making it inevitable, and it's for our benefit, thus forwarding ourselves through natural selection. Combined with his aforementioned views on the virtues of evangelizing Christianity to subjugated peoples, Darwin's ideas about extermination provide a pretty easy justification for colonialism, which was experiencing a resurgence toward the later end of Darwin's life. Because of this reasoning, and specifically how tightly it's wrapped up in Darwinian theory, racial extermination is a logical extension of social Darwinism, even if Darwin himself would have been opposed to it. Okay, I've thrown a lot at you, so let's gather our thoughts and then come to a conclusion about Darwin and his ideas. So I hope that through my little exploration here, I've communicated that Charles Darwin is a really complicated figure. On the one hand, he formulated one of the most important scientific theories of the modern era, completely revolutionizing science, but also how humanity sees itself in the world. But on the other, Darwin didn't have everything understood, requiring the work of hundreds, if not thousands, of scientists to iron out and amend the weak parts of his theory. On the one hand, Darwin himself championed sympathy, and his work inspired many to seek solidarity with their fellow humans, given that they all descended from the same stock, and to struggle for genuinely progressive social change. On the other hand, social Darwinism served to protect the interests of those most powerful in society, maintaining dangerous social hierarchies and providing justification for the upper classes not only to neglect the poor, but actively restrict their rights. On the one hand, Darwin promoted ideas that refuted racist notions of separate creations, promoting a unified humanity that extended beyond racial boundaries. On the other hand, Darwin clearly expressed white supremacist ideas and inadvertently provided cover for subsequent racial pseudoscience and policies up to and including extermination. As I rewatch Human Zoos, I'm struck by one specific quote toward the end.
But although scientific racism no longer receives support from mainstream science, many in the scientific community remain reluctant to honestly discuss the past.
Though I take issue with much of the framing and claims of this documentary, I have to agree. Darwin's accomplishments are frequently touted in biology classrooms, and the dangerous political implications of his work are discussed in history classrooms without reference to the man himself. I feel that we do a disservice by downplaying Darwin's own ideas about race and politics, as we leave the door open for people like the Discovery Institute to jump in and tell the real truth about Darwin. Think of those who Darwin would have considered inferior, whether by race or class or disability, and to brush off his thoughts about these groups, to dismiss the ideas simply as products of his time without taking a moment to genuinely criticize the man. It sends a message that the racism, classism, and ableism that Darwin supported, both intentionally and unintentionally, aren't important considerations. Darwin's social views and the dangerous interpretations of his theory aren't separated from the science. Darwin was influenced by political and philosophical thinking, including Whiggism and Malthusianism, to produce his scientific theories. And when those theories were applied to society, it's no coincidence that the application echoed Malthus and the Whigs. Science doesn't originate in a vacuum separate from the political and social context that it originates, especially science that deals with issues of life's origins and mechanics. So pretending like Darwin's science can be cleaved away from its social and political influences and implications is not only ahistorical, harmful. So, for as big of a figure that Darwin is today, I propose that we treat him with the nuance he deserves, not writing him off as an irredeemable monster, but also not glorifying him as a secular saint. Darwin is a complicated figure, like most from history. He contributed praiseworthy theories that continue to revolutionize our ideas about nature and science, but he also unleashed justifications for some of the worst crimes committed by humanity, which is unambiguously deserving of condemnation. Darwin is so much bigger than a cliché hero or villain, and it's about time we recognize that. Okay, wow. Thank you so much for watching until the end. There is a lot more I wanted to talk about, like the American Eugenics movement and Darwin's views on human zoos specifically. In fact, I sort of wanted to go off more on that documentary. But as you can see, the video ended up being pretty long without all that. And honestly, I felt like I only grazed the surface. So that tells you something about how deep Darwin and what we know about him really is. So this is the first video that I've made, so hopefully you found the audio and editing and other stuff at least semi-tolerable. I'm still learning how to do the YouTube stuff, so I thank you for your patience. I plan on making more videos about science and history and politics and many other things, so if any of that interests you, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.